Hi, this is Professor Fred Long, and we're looking at sentences from Chapter 16E, looking at the first four and the last odd. I'll be sentence diagramming these. I will not be adding comments, typing them in, but I'll be commenting on the text. I'm assuming that you've already translated the text or are looking to translate it. You can see the zones across the top here. There'll also be another place where the zones will be present, and I'll align things according to those zones as best as I can. There's different ways to represent the zones. This is a watermark that I've placed within the Word document. So let's get going. I'll translate and align things in zones. So I got the verse reference, then initial conjunction ke, and then the subject zone. Well, I have to look way at the end to find the subject. Panta ta ethne. And what I'm doing is putting this into its proper place. I had to layer that. I used a hard return in order to place the modifier in a proper relationship. Now I indicate modifiers by putting three spaces over from the beginning, and I can represent that by dashes, or I can just leave it as spaces. So now I'm looking at the main verb, sunak the sonte, and this means will be gathered together. And so that's now in its verb zone. And I'm left here with a prepositional phrase, improsten avtu, before him. And so I have to decide, what is this modifying? Is it modifying the nations right here? Or is it modifying the verb will be gathered together? And I think it's modifying the verb. So, and all the nations will be gathered before him. Now, in terms of sentence order, it is typical that the verb would come first, and that's what this shows, is the verb first, and then you have the subject. But there's also emphasis to be had by final placement. And I think given the fact that there's a quantitative modifier, panta, here, that we could say that there's final emphasis, because there's also quantitative emphasis. And there's some fronting here in terms of the modifier. It's placed before the verb in a modifying relationship. So the stress here would be on all the nations will be gathered before him. Now don't worry that these modifiers are running over into the next zone. This zone is fixed in terms of the watermark behind the text. The main thing is you want to get the main elements in their zones. So here's the initial conjunction, here's the subject, and then here's the main verb. There are no complements in this verse, and we're going to see that a lot with these simpler verses, sentences, the first four. But when we get to the last odd sentence, like here 19, we're going to see that there's going to be some more complexity and subordinate clauses and these kinds of things. Okay, well, I'm going to move pretty quickly here. There's a ke, probably meaning and there was a person, or a person was there. I'm probably going to just put the person, anthropos, in the subject zone, even though in English we might say, there was a person. We might think, well, it's really the object complement or predicate nominative, but it's really the subject. And a man was there, and so here we're just having another sentence. This is a kind of a double sentence. And then we have the subject there, his hand. And what do we know about his hand? His avtu is modifying hand, and it's not just any hand, but it's his adexia, his right hand. Then we have the verb again, was withered. Zera is the predicate adjective, meaning withered. It's an adjective. We'll put it in the complement zone, which is normally for direct objects, but You can also, it's the place for like predicate nominatives, predicate adjectives. So we see here that there was a man there, and his hand, the right one, was withered. Now why mention the right one? Why not just say his hand was withered? Well, the significance of the right hand is that it's the strong hand, it's the one that's normally in use. So this helps to explain the situation that this man was in, kind of a tough situation, not to have use of his right hand, the one that's normally to be used. Okay, so Revelation 22:13, there's no conjunction, and then you just have an ego. Well, that's in the nominative case. We think that's probably going to just be the subject. Now, literally the sentence is, I am the Alpha and the Omega. Then you have the first and the last, and then you have the beginning and the end. Well, notice that there's no expressed verb, but there's an implied verb. And we can type that in English. Don't type it in Greek because you'll create textual variance. You don't want to do that. But you can add that am there. And then what we have is a series of predicate nominatives, and they're compound. I'm just going to leave them compounded like that. I am the Alpha and Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Probably the second two could be almost understood as appositional. Basically what's happening is that you're having a rich description of who this person is, and Alpha and Omega is then further qualified as the first and last, the beginning and the end. Alright, Acts 4:27. Here's the verb, were gathered. And then we see a post-positive conjunction. So what we need to do is begin layering this. We'll put the gar. I'm actually going to lower this down. So I'm going to, so we can see these zones again in this watermark right here. I'm going to put the verb in the verb zone. Were gathered. We don't know who the they are. The they is found in the ending. This is aorist passive, they were. This is from sunago, to be gathered, or to gather. For they were gathered. They were gathered in truth in this city. So these are all a set of modifiers modifying the verb were gathered. In this city against, here means against. So you have all these prepositions lining up here to modify the verb were gathered. They were gathered in truth in this city. Technically, tavte modifies city. And what I need to do here is change the spacing. So pardon me when I change that to single. That'll kind of help things. So you can see that this verb zone is then full of these three prepositional phrases, and then we have finally, there's some question as to what's modifying what here. That's a big part of sentence diagramming is identifying the function of the basic sentence components, conjunction, subject, verb, complements, if they're present, and then everything else is a modifier. So in this case, we just have an initial conjunction. We could type in a they, but type it in English if you really need to understand the subject. And then you have these prepositional modifiers. And so what I'm doing here is this last one, against your holy servant. Technically, servant child is modified by you, and then also modified appositionally by Jesus. In other words, the equal sign here helps to indicate that we know who this servant child is. And technically, and I don't always like to do this, the is a modifier and holy is a modifier. So you have these different modifiers. I don't like to go into that much detail, but that's technically how it looks. Against a servant, or the servant, and not just the servant, but the holy servant, and not just the holy servant, but your holy servant. And then we have the appositional statement, namely Jesus. So I'm not going to layer things to this extent, but in this case I just want to show you the modification. So now we get to the longest odd sentence in chapter exercise 16. Now we have direct quote, and I see that right away because I got a verb of saying, and I'm assuming that you know how to mark the sentences, because by this point, working through Kairos or working through Koine Greek Grammar, that you will know how to do that. So we have the verb, and then we have an indirect object. Now what I do with indirect objects is place them under the verb. They perhaps could deserve their own zone, but you don't often have them, and the zones can be hard enough for people to learn as it is. Now notice what I'm doing here. I'm putting the direct quote, that which is directly quoted, inside the complement zone. Okay? Because really the direct quote is the equivalent of a direct object. And so the whole utterance, the whole statement, is then referenced and started here in the complement zone. So at this point then we have a complex sentence, a complex sentence because we have a subordinate clause in the form of a direct discourse. Now the men and the dead become really important here because they help to balance two things. Remember the men-de construction. On the one hand, you will drink my cup. So at this point, the zones become relative. These zones are repeated inside this clause. So that's why I'm putting these conjunctions first, and then I'm looking for the subject, if there is one. Then I'm looking for the verb. So I don't see a express subject in this first one. It's a you, and then I have my cup. Now my cup really is the direct object of drink. Indeed, on the one hand, you will drink my cup, and the mu is modifying drink here. Once again, I need to put that into single spacing. So you will drink my cup, and I'm going to put the article in as a modifier, which technically it is, and but on the other hand, so on the one hand, you will drink my cup, he says to them, but on the other hand, to sit at my right and my left, okay, that's all the subject, this whole thing, and it's an infinitive, and you haven't had those yet, but it means to sit, but to sit from the right and from my right and from the left. It is not mine to give. This is a rather hard sentence. You have to kind of rely on the English translation down below. So, and here we've run out of room, and this sometimes happens with semantic diagramming. So to sit is being modified by both my right and my left. And these go together, modifying the sitting. And that really is functioning as the subject of "it is not mine" in order to give. And so at this point I need to go to the next page and start my diagram over, just in terms of fitting it all in. So he says to them, on the one hand, "You will drink my cup," but on the other hand, to sit from the right, my right and my left, "it is not mine." Now this is a possessive adjective, which means mine, so it's in the predicate adjective zone. It is not mine, this is not mine to give. Now I'm going to put the "this." Notice that this is questionable in the original text. It refers back to the sitting. This is not mine. And really, to give is in order to give. So it's a subordinate purpose clause, but you wouldn't know that necessarily because you haven't had Greek enough yet, the infinitive. But it is not mine to give, but rather the sitting is for those to whom. So here you have an implied the sitting from above, and then the verb is understood, is really for those to whom it is prepared. For whom it has been prepared. Now this begins a relative pronoun clause. If I were to do marking, I'd be having it in brackets, and I can use both methods here. Now the to whom is modifying the is as the beneficiary. It belongs to them, but it also functions as the direct object of "it has been prepared for them." So this three spaces over is modifying both verbs, is, the implied is, and the perfect tense has been prepared, and then you have another prepositional phrase here, by my father, and the mu modifies father. So that is how you would semantically diagram number 19 of chapter 16, exercise 16.